People often say, the cruelest thing in life is a gun on the battlefield. They're wrong. The most painful, fatal blow always comes from those sitting next to you at the family dinner table, smiling. My brother used my brain power and the sleepless nights at my military base to build his glamorous career. And my parents? They stripped away my hard work, handed it to him, and called it family love. This is the story of how I called in an airstrike to wipe out that whole charade. Welcome to Noble Revenge. Get comfortable, brew a cup of strong coffee. The people in this story all had a chance to do the right thing. They didn't. Leave a comment and remember to subscribe. You'll like it here. If you stepped into the Wilcox living room in Chicago, you'd be certain this house only had one golden sun. Walls covered in photos of Dylan in expensive suits, corporate awards, and fake smiles. Me, Elisa Wilcox, Lieutenant, U.S. Army Cyber Warfare. The only photo of me in field gear is shoved in a corner by the umbrella stand, covered in dust. No one in this house understands what I do. And the truth is, they don't even care. The hallway smelled strongly like old wood and the lemon-scented floor wax my mother used to hide the rot of a failing marriage. I let my hand brush a dusty frame near the umbrella stand. Me at 23, sweat-stained and gritty, boots caked in red clay during a training op in Georgia. To Richard and Diane, it was a shameful souvenir of a career they couldn't brag about at the club. I pulled my shoulders back, the habit of the uniform even in civilian clothes, and stepped into the dining room. The transition hit like a physical punch. Behind me was the dust and silence of the hallway. Ahead, under a heavy brass chandelier, it was all golden light and the sharp clink of silver on china. "Elisa, you're late," Richard said without looking up. He was uncorking a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, the $50 stuff he saved for Sunday nights. He poured a glass for himself, then for Dylan. He set the bottle down with a heavy thud. He didn't even look at my empty glass. I pulled out my chair, the wood scraping against the floor like a blade. I sat down, my spine a steel rod. I was wearing a plain gray cotton t-shirt. Dylan sat across from me, looking like a tech brochure in a tailored silk shirt that cost more than my monthly housing allowance. Diane emerged from the kitchen a moment later, a tray of ribeyes in her hands. The smell was thick, heavy, and salty. She bypassed me entirely and set the largest cut right in front of Dylan. "Our big boy needs his protein," she said, patting his shoulder. She finally looked at me, her smile tight. "There's salad in the bowl, Elisa." I picked up my fork. The silver felt cold. "The DoD just approved my new neural network project," I said. My voice was flat. "It's a big step for the unit." Diane didn't even pause. She was busy piling potatoes onto Dylan's plate. "That's nice, honey. I'm sure it's technical." She leaned toward Dylan, her eyes gleaming with pride. "But Dylan, tell us about that director position, the one with the corner office." My words just hung there, unacknowledged. I took a bite of the steak. It was gray and overcooked. I forced myself to swallow the dry lump in my throat, my eyes fixed on the polished oak table. Dylan let out a short, arrogant laugh. He was watching the wine swirl in his glass. "Meridian is fast-tracking me to VP of Engineering," he boasted. "The board loves the new optimization code I wrote. It's going to disrupt the industry." He finally looked at me, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You know, Elisa, you're wasting your time in the dirt. The Army pays peanuts. Why don't you try writing real code? I could probably get you a junior dev spot at Meridian if you're tired of playing soldier." The mockery sat on the table like a challenge. I felt the heat rising in my gut, being small-talked into a corner by a man who couldn't explain a recursive loop. I gripped my fork until my knuckles turned ghost white, the metal digging into my palm. I didn't snap. I didn't yell. Silence is a weapon too. I chose the discipline of the quiet. Then my phone buzzed. The vibration was sharp and insistent against my thigh, a digital intrusion. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. 2300 hours, a late-night alert. It was an email from Marcus Webb, a civilian analyst I'd worked with on the Meridian Pentagon project. The subject line popped up in white text. My heart did a heavy roll. Subject: Does the Meridian algorithm have your signature? I put my fork down. The sound of it hitting the porcelain was like a gunshot. I stopped breathing for a second, my eyes locked onto the screen. The battle hadn't just started, it was already over. I just had to decide exactly when to pull the final trigger on them. The subject line of that email felt like a cold blade pressing against my jugular. Does the Meridian algorithm have your signature? Marcus Webb did not send emails like that for fun. He was a numbers man, a data ghost. If he saw my signature in the code, it was there. My skin crawled. A familiar, oily chill settled in the base of my spine. It was the same feeling I had 6 years ago. The memory hit me hard. It was 2 a.m. I was 22 years old, a cadet at the academy, buried in the basement of a server room. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burnt coffee. The kind of cheap, bitter Dunkin' coffee that leaves a film on your tongue. The industrial fans hummed a low, aggressive rhythm. My eyes were bloodshot, staring at the lines of logic on my screen. Then, my phone rattled on the metal desk. It was Dylan. I picked up. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing after 48 hours of drill. His voice was slurred, heavy with the sound of 3 too many cheap beers and raw panic. "Elisa, you have to help me," he whined. He was 24 then, supposedly finishing his master's degree. "I am going to fail the advanced systems course. The final project is due tomorrow morning. I cannot do it. I do not understand the recursion." I told him I was exhausted. I told him I had my own finals. He did not care. He spent 10 minutes crying about how Richard would cut his tuition if he failed. He played the victim until my ears rang. I gave in. I always gave in back then. I spent the next 12 hours grinding out every line of that code, hammering the keys until my fingers went numb. I built a sophisticated architecture for him. I polished it. I sent it. The next afternoon, I walked into the kitchen in Naperville. A sheet of paper was pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a smiling sun. A plus. Dylan's name was at the top. He was sitting at the table, eating a sandwich Richard had made for him. He did not look at me. He did not say, "Thank you." He acted as if those lines of code had appeared in his brain by divine intervention. I walked up to the fridge. I touched the paper. "That took me all night, Dylan," I said. My voice was a whisper. "A thank you would be nice." Dylan snorted. "You were doing it anyway, Al. Do not act like it was a big deal." I turned to Richard, looking for some kind of justice. He just sipped his coffee and kept reading the Wall Street Journal. Then Diane walked in. She was drying her hands on a floral apron, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. She did not see a daughter who was tired. She saw a problem. "Elisa, stop it," Diane said. Her voice was soft but heavy with a guilt that felt like lead. "This is your brother. Family always supports each other. It is your duty to make sure he succeeds. Do not be so selfish." That was the lie, the systematic brainwashing. My talent was not mine. It was a family resource. My hard work was just a tool for Dylan to climb. That conversation was the seed. It grew into a thick, thorny vine that wrapped around my throat for years. Flash forward to the present. I am standing in my childhood bedroom. The walls are a pale, clinical blue. I locked the door. The click of the deadbolt felt final. The dinner downstairs was a charade, but the threat in my pocket was real. I thought about why the code was on his servers. I thought about the family cloud. 2 years ago, when I was being moved between bases, my military-issued laptop had a motherboard failure in the middle of a desert heatwave. I was desperate. I had to save my draft for the Meridian Pentagon neural network. I did not have a secure external drive on me. Richard had set up a shared family drive years ago. He called it the Vault. He told us it was for photos and tax documents. I uploaded my encrypted draft there for 48 hours, just long enough to get to my new station. I thought it was a temporary bridge. I did not realize I had left the door wide open for a parasite. The realization made my stomach turn. Dylan had been lurking. He had been watching my folders like a hawk. He did not just take one file. He took the soul of my work. I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress creaked. I pulled my ruggedized military laptop out of my backpack. It was heavy, scarred, and built for war. I opened the lid. The blue light hit my face, reflecting in my eyes. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I navigated to the cloud logs. My fingers hovered over the keys. This was the moment. Once I looked at the access history, there would be no going back to the girl who stayed silent at dinner. Have you ever been the invisible one, carrying the weight of someone else's laziness while they took the glory? If you have felt that burn, if you have lived through that injustice, comment "done" below. Let us show them that we are tired of being silent. Like and subscribe to see how I tear his world apart. We are just getting started. I took a deep breath. I pressed the button to view the history. I waited for the truth to finish loading. The screen flickered. My eyes scanned the list of IP addresses. There it was. 47 separate downloads. All from a residential address in Chicago, Dylan's apartment. I stared at the screen until the text blurred. The betrayal was total. It was not a mistake. It was a harvest. I closed the laptop slowly. My hands were no longer shaking. They were cold. I knew exactly what I had to do. I did not need a family. I needed a target. The silence in the house was heavy. Downstairs, I could hear Dylan laughing at something on the television. He thought he was safe. He thought he had won. He was wrong. He had just handed me the coordinates for his own destruction. The mouse clicked. A dry plastic snap in the dead silence of my childhood bedroom. My finger didn't shake. On the screen, the progress bar for the family cloud access logs crawled forward like a terminal diagnosis. I didn't wait for it to finish. I opened a second window and navigated to the Meridian Corporation's public blog. I wanted to see exactly how much of my life he had sold. There it was. A glossy, high-res headshot of Dylan Wilcox. He was wearing that same smirk from dinner, his hair perfectly coiffed, teeth bleached to a blinding corporate white. The headline above him screamed, "Propelling the Future, How Our New VP of Engineering is Disrupting Neural Adaptive Networks." I scrolled down. My breath hitched, not with sadness, but with the cold, calculated shock of a soldier identifying a breach. There were the diagrams, the architecture, the logic gates for the optimization subroutine. It was my work, line for line, logic for logic. He hadn't even had the technical skill to improve it. He had just gone in and clumsily renamed the variables. He took my adaptive weight underscore vector and called it smart gain. He took months of my sweat, my sleepless nights in fortified basements, and slapped a cheap corporate sticker over it. He was building his throne out of the bricks I had fired in the kiln of my own exhaustion. The cloud log finally refreshed. I felt the air leave the room. 47 entries. 47 separate times my brother had logged into a drive meant for tax returns and family photos to strip mine my professional folders. I didn't look away. I focused on the timestamps. They were a casualty list of my sacrifices. July 14th, 03:15 hours. I remembered that night with a clarity that burned. I was at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California. We were 48 hours into a simulated blackout. The Mojave Desert was a furnace, even at midnight. I was covered in a layer of fine, gray dust that tasted like copper and old pennies. My skin was raw under 30 pounds of body armor. I was huddled in the back of a Humvee, sharing a lukewarm canteen with my sergeant, miles away from a hot shower or a decent meal. I was out there protecting a digital infrastructure for a country that didn't know my name. And while I was swallowing sand, Dylan was sitting in his air-conditioned Chicago apartment, probably drinking a $10 craft beer and clicking "download all" on my life's work. He did it again in August while I was on a 20-mile ruck march in Georgia. He did it in September while I was pulling a double shift at the Cyber Ops Center because a teammate's kid was sick. Every time I was in the dirt, he was in my pockets. The blue light from the laptop screen hit the thin, white scar on my forehead, a jagged souvenir from a jagged Humvee door during a night op. I didn't cry. Tears are just a waste of hydration in a combat zone. I felt a hollow Arctic space open up inside my chest. It was the same feeling you get right before the first shot is fired in an ambush. Total, lethal clarity. I wasn't a sister anymore. I was a lieutenant, and Dylan Wilcox was no longer my brother. He was a hostile actor, a domestic threat. I opened my tactical software. My hands moved with a rhythmic, military precision. Screenshot, save, metadata verification. Source IP confirmation 192.168.1.15. His home router. I pulled a ruggedized encrypted USB drive from my kit bag. The metal casing was cold and scratched. It clicked into the port like a magazine locking into a rifle. I moved the files. I moved the logs. I moved every shred of evidence that proved Dylan Wilcox was nothing more than a common thief in a tailored suit. When the transfer bar hit 100%, I didn't hesitate. I shut the laptop. The lid slammed with a heavy final thud that echoed off the pale blue walls. I stood up, my spine a steel rod. Downstairs, the house was silent. Richard and Diane were asleep, dreaming of their golden son's bright future. They had no idea I had just turned their family cloud into a digital crime scene. 700 hours. The air at the base the next morning was sharp, smelling of diesel exhaust and scorched gravel. The sun was a pale, uncaring disk over the motor pool. I walked into the administrative building, my boots hitting the linoleum with a steady, aggressive tempo. I didn't stop for the morning briefing. I didn't stop for coffee. I walked straight to the office of Colonel Elaine Marsh. She was a woman built out of iron and institutional knowledge. She looked up from a stack of intel reports, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. I didn't wait for her to invite me in. I walked to her desk and dropped a thick manila folder onto the center of her blotter. The sound was heavy, the sound of a hammer falling. "Colonel," I said. My voice was level, unbreakable. "Lieutenant Wilcox, you're supposed to be on leave until Monday." "I need my deployment orders to the Pentagon confirmed, ma'am." "Immediately. I'm ready to move." She looked at the folder. She looked at me. She had been in the service for 30 years. She knew the look of a soldier who had just crossed a point of no return. She saw the ghost of the daughter leave my eyes, replaced by the officer who was done taking hits. "Is there a situation, Elisa?" "Just a security breach in my AO, ma'am. I'm handling the extraction now." She didn't ask for details. She just nodded once, a short, professional acknowledgement. She pulled the digital pad toward her and signed the authorization. "You're cleared. You leave for Washington in 72 hours. Pack light, Lieutenant." "Always do, ma'am." I walked out of that office and into the bright, unforgiving morning light of the base. I pulled my phone out. I scrolled to Dylan's name. My thumb hovered over the screen. I hit dial. He picked up on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and the laziness of someone who had never worked for a thing in his life. "Al, it's early. What do you want?" "Dinner Sunday," I said. No emotion, just a mission brief. "I'll be there. Mom said you had news to celebrate. I want to be there to see it." "Yeah, VP spot. It's huge. You finally coming around to congratulate me?" "Something like that," I said. My eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the storm was already gathering. "See you at 6, Dylan. Don't be late." I hung up. I looked at the black screen of the phone. The coordinates were locked. The payload was ready. All I had to do was wait for the Sunday dinner to serve as the ground zero for his destruction. I walked out of Colonel Marsh's office with a single sheet of paper that felt heavier than my combat gear. Deployment orders, destination, Washington, D.C. The ink was still fresh, but the path ahead was already paved in ice. I didn't tell a soul. For the next 3 months, I became a ghost. I practiced the ultimate military discipline, the art of the tactical retreat. I retreated into silence. I retreated into the shadows of my own life, watching the Wilcox family from the periphery like an observer at a long-distance target range. Living in a cramped $900 studio near the base felt like penance. The linoleum floor was cracked, and the radiator hissed like a dying animal every time the Chicago wind rattled the window frames. Dinner was usually a bowl of canned chicken noodle soup eaten over a laptop. It was a stark contrast to the life my brother was buying with my blood. Every Sunday, I drove back to the suburbs. I sat at that mahogany table and watched the display of stolen wealth. Dylan had a new car, a sleek black German sedan that roared with a cocky, overcompensated engine. He was wearing suits that cost more than my car, tailored to hide the fact that he was soft. "Meridian is treating you right, son," Richard said during a dinner in mid-May, his voice thick with a pride he never spared for me. He patted Dylan's shoulder, a heavy masculine endorsement. Dylan beamed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He flipped it open to reveal a diamond ring that caught the light of the chandelier. "For Brooke," Dylan announced, his smirk wide and hollow. "Nothing but the best for my future wife. The bonus for the neural network project just cleared." I chewed my overcooked green beans slowly. I felt the dry texture in my throat. I didn't let a single muscle in my face twitch. I didn't look at the ring. I looked at the way Dylan's hands fumbled with the box, clumsy hands that had never built a single line of logic. I sipped my water, the cold liquid a sharp reminder of the clarity I was maintaining. I was a professional. I was a hunter. And a hunter doesn't fire until the target is perfectly aligned in the crosshairs. The alignment happened on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks later. It was nearly midnight. I was sitting on my floor, cleaning my service pistol out of habit, the smell of gun oil and cold air filling the small room. My phone buzzed on the floorboards. Dylan. I didn't pick up immediately. I let it ring. I finished wiping the slide, then I tapped the screen. I hit the speakerphone, and more importantly, I hit the red record button on my secondary device. "Al, you awake?" His voice was breathless, panicked. I could hear the rustle of papers and the frantic clicking of a mouse in the background. "I'm dying here, Al. I've got the board of directors presentation tomorrow morning." "Is there a problem, Dylan?" I asked. My voice was the flat monotone of a drone operator. "The damping mechanism," he hissed, his voice cracking. "The engineers at Meridian are asking questions. They want to know why the feedback loop is suppressed at the 10th layer." I looked at the code, but it's dense, you know. I can't explain the math. If I look like an idiot tomorrow, the vice president spot is gone. I leaned back against the wall, a cold, jagged smile touching my lips. He was calling the author to teach him how to use the weapon he'd stolen. "It's just a standard recursive suppression, Dylan," I said. I spoke slowly, my tone dripping with the forced patience one uses for a slow-witted child. "The 10th layer is where the data noise peaks. If you don't damp it there, the whole network cascades. It's basic architecture." Right, suppression noise," he muttered. I heard him typing furiously. "God, you're a lifesaver, Al. Seriously, you're such a good sister. I don't know why Mom says you're being difficult lately. You're the best." He spent the next 20 minutes begging for more. He needed the logic for the error correction protocols. He needed the justification for the memory allocation. I gave it to him. I fed him every detail, lead piping the information into his desperate, grasping hands. I didn't question him. I didn't mock him. I just kept the recording running. "I owe you one, Al," he said, his voice finally relaxing. He sounded smug again. The panic was gone, replaced by the unearned confidence of a man who thought he'd gotten away with it. "When I'm vice president, I'll buy you a real dinner, none of that army mess hall crap." "I'm sure you will," I said. I hung up. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I picked up the recording device, 22 minutes of Dylan Wilcox admitting, in his own trembling voice, that he couldn't explain the core mechanics of the product he claimed to have invented. I plugged the device into my laptop. I saved the file. I didn't use a clever name. I named it like a forensic analyst. Evidence 04, subject unable to explain core source code. Duration 22 minutes. I watched the file upload to my encrypted server. It felt like watching a hammer being cocked back. Dylan had no idea he had just tied the noose around his own neck and handed me the rope. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Diane. "Sunday dinner at 6 o'clock. Your father and I need to discuss your recent attitude. Be there." I looked at the message, then back at the Evidence 04 file. The 3 months of waiting were over. The deployment to DC was only days away, and my crates were already packed. This wouldn't be a normal Sunday dinner. It was going to be a tribunal. I didn't reply to the text. I just closed the laptop. The red light of the recording app stayed burned into my retina for a few seconds in the dark. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all that was left was to let the Wilcox family play out their little drama until I decided to end it for good. The sound of clear packing tape shrieking against a cardboard box is the loneliest sound in the world. It is a sharp, jagged noise that cuts through the silence of a life being erased. Rip, shriek, press. I did it 11 times. 11 heavy-duty boxes for 11 years of a life that had been nothing but a long, slow crawl through the mud. By mid-June, my studio apartment on the gritty edge of the base was a hollow shell. The walls were bare, leaving behind pale rectangles where my military commendations and a single map of the Chicago suburbs used to hang. The shadow of my metal bed frame was the only thing left on the stained industrial carpet. My lease was officially terminated. My utilities were cut. And not one single person in the Wilcox family knew I was leaving. They hadn't called to ask how I was in 3 months. They didn't know I had a new zip code. They didn't know I had a new soul. I stood in the center of the room, my boots echoing on the hardwood. I was a ghost in my own home. I looked at the 11 boxes stacked near the door, neat and square, like a row of soldiers at attention. There was a grim satisfaction in the emptiness. I was stripping away the last of the camouflage. I wasn't Elisa the daughter anymore. I wasn't Elisa the sister. I was an asset in transit. Wednesday afternoon. The door buzzed, a harsh, mechanical rasp that made my skin crawl. I didn't have to look at the grainy monitor to know it was him. I could smell the arrogance through the wood. Dylan leaned against the doorframe when I opened it, looking like a man who had just won the lottery and forgotten he had stolen the ticket. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost 3 months of my hazard pay. He smelled like expensive wood smoke and top-shelf bourbon, the heavy, oaky stuff he had clearly raided from Richard's private stash before driving over. He walked into my kitchen without asking and pulled a crystal tumbler from his pocket. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling against the glass. He didn't offer me any. He didn't even look for a chair. He leaned against my cheap laminate counter, his silk tie loosened just enough to look busy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, weighted key fob. He tossed it in the air and caught it. Jingle, 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 jingle. The sound of a brand new German engine. VP roll is a lock, Al, Dylan said, his voice thick with the unearned confidence of a tech bro who had never seen a day of real dirt. The board at Meridian loved the presentation. They said the logic was airtight. Brooke is already looking at venues. She wants a June wedding, maybe the Ritz. The bonus I got for the neural network project is paying for the whole thing. It is a hell of a life, isn't it? I took a slow sip of lukewarm tap water from a plastic cup. I watched him. I watched the way his eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting mine. He was so high on the smell of his own bullshit he couldn't see the cliff he was standing on. I let the silence hang between us until it made him itch. I watched a drop of condensation roll down his glass. The recursive layer in that code, I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. That was the hardest part. It took me 8 months to get that logic to hold. You remember how much of a grind that was, Dylan? Dylan didn't even blink. He took a long, greedy pull of his bourbon, his eyes shining with a sickening triumph. He let out a short, bark-like laugh. 8 months? Tell me about it, Al. I was pulling 60-hour weeks on that specific block. I practically lived in the IDE. I know every single semicolon of that layer like the back of my hand. It was a nightmare, but I made it work. I stared at him, really looked at him. He didn't know I had spent 14 months on that specific block of code. He didn't know that by agreeing to my 8-month lie, he had just signed his own death warrant in front of a digital mirror. He was a parasite who had forgotten he didn't have a heartbeat of his own. He was a thief who had started to believe his own propaganda. Good for you, Dylan, I said. My heart was a cold stone. You really earned it. He finished his drink and set the glass on the counter with a heavy thud. He didn't wash it. He just wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and walked toward the door, his new shoes clicking like a countdown. See you Sunday, Al. Mom says you have been acting weird. Don't ruin the celebration, okay? It is a big night for the family. Friday afternoon arrived like a gut punch. 4 p.m. The sky over Chicago was the color of a bruised lung, heavy with the promise of a summer storm. My phone rattled on the empty counter, the vibration sounding like a snake in the dry grass. Diane. I picked up. Her voice was ice. No, hello? No, how are you? Just a sharp, jagged command that tasted like copper. You will be home for dinner at 6, Elisa, Diane said. Your father and I have had enough of this distance. This attitude of yours. It is disrespectful to your brother's success. We are going to sit down and settle this tonight, properly. Do not be late. She hung up before I could breathe. A family court had been summoned. I looked at the black screen of the phone, then at the 11 boxes by the door. The truck was already waiting 2 blocks away. I reached into the last open crate and pulled out my OCP field jacket. The fabric was stiff, smelling of starch and old gunpowder. The Velcro on the rank insignia scratched against my palm, a dry, aggressive sound. I put it on. I zipped it up to the throat. I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't need an apology. I was a soldier going into a breach. I walked to the door and didn't look back at the empty room. The execution was scheduled for 6 o'clock. I parked the U-Haul truck 2 blocks away, tucked behind a row of overgrown maples where the streetlights couldn't reach. The engine died with a heavy metallic shudder. 11 boxes. My entire life was sitting in the dark, 500 feet from a family that didn't even know I was leaving. I sat there for a minute, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. The cabin smelled like old vinyl and cold air. I reached into the breast pocket of my OCP jacket and felt the hard, rectangular edge of the encrypted USB drive. It was my only ally in a house full of enemies. I took a deep breath, checked the time, 1800 hours, and stepped out into the humid Chicago night. The Wilcox house stood like a fortress of Midwestern respectability. Perfectly manicured lawn. Warm, inviting lights in the windows. A complete lie. I walked through the front door, and the air changed instantly. It was thick with the scent of slow-cooked pot roast and expensive red wine. Richard was already at the head of the mahogany table, his hands clasped together like a judge presiding over a sentencing. Dylan sat to his right, wearing a fresh white shirt, looking down at his plate with the practiced, pathetic slump of a victim. Brooke sat next to him, her eyes fixed on the gold-rimmed china. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I pulled out my chair. The wood groaned against the floor. I sat down, my spine a steel rod, and didn't touch my napkin. "You're on time," Richard said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of a man used to being obeyed. He didn't look at me. He was busy pouring gravy over a pile of mashed potatoes. "That's a start. Sit, eat." Diane emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a linen towel. She didn't smile. She just sat down and stared at me with a look of disappointed pity. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, sharp clink of silver hitting porcelain. Dylan took a small bite of meat, his breathing heavy and performative, as if the mere presence of his sister was an emotional burden he could barely carry. Richard cleared his throat. He set his fork down with a deliberate thud. "We've been talking, Elisa. Your mother, Dylan, and I. We've noticed a pattern. The distance, the coldness, the way you look at your brother when he talks about his success at Meridian." "Is that a fact?" I asked. My voice was a flat line. "It's an observation," Richard snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp anger. "You're bitter, Elisa. You're jealous of the life Dylan has built while you've been out playing soldier in the mud. It's poison. It's affecting the harmony of this house. Brooke is about to join this family, and we won't have her seeing this kind of petty resentment." Diane leaned forward, her voice dropping into that soft, manipulative register she used when she wanted to draw blood. "Elisa, honey, we just want you to take accountability. Dylan is a good man. He's been nothing but kind to you. You need to apologize to him, right here, right now, for the attitude, for the disrespect." I looked at Dylan. He finally looked up, his eyes moist with fake hurt. "I just want us to be a family again, Al," he whispered. The audacity of it made the bile rise in my throat. He was wearing the shirt bought with my bonus, sitting in a house paid for by the father who was now helping him bury the truth. "Apologize for what, exactly?" I asked. I felt the cold weight of the USB against my chest. Richard slammed his palm onto the table. The wine glasses rattled. Brooke flinched. "Enough of the games. You apologize because I said so. I've supported you, Elisa. I've paid the gap in your rent for that studio apartment for 2 years. I've made sure you had a safety net while you chased your little military career. But that ends tonight." He leaned back, a cruel, satisfied smirk crossing his face. He thought he had just pulled the pin on a grenade. "Until you show some humility, until you fix your head and treat your brother with the respect he deserves, the checks stop. Every cent. You're on your own, Elisa. Let's see how that army-strong attitude works when you're out on the street." He thought he was holding my leash. He thought that a few $100s a month was the price of my soul. He didn't know about the 11 boxes. He didn't know about the Pentagon. He didn't know that I had already cut the cord hours ago. The room went cold. Dylan's smirk grew wider, a jagged expression of triumph. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully weaponized our father to silence the only person who knew he was a fraud. Have you ever sat across from someone who thought they owned you just because they signed the checks? If you have felt the weight of that financial chain, if you have been told to stay silent for a price, comment Roger below. Let them know we cannot be bought. Like and subscribe to see the moment the chain finally snaps. I didn't blink. I didn't yell. I reached out and picked up my knife and fork. I didn't cut the meat. I simply placed them side by side, perfectly parallel, centered on the gold-rimmed plate. It was a precise military alignment, a signal of the end of the engagement. I looked Richard dead in the eye, my gaze as sharp as a razor blade. "Roger," I said. The word hung in the air, cold and final. Richard's smirk faltered. He expected a plea. He expected a tearful apology. He didn't understand that he had just handed me the final justification I needed to burn it all down. I pushed my chair back, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. I stood up, zipped my jacket to the chin, and walked out without looking back. The trial was over. The execution was scheduled for the morning. Richard's smirk was wide, ugly, and satisfied. He looked at me as if I were a dog finally learning to sit on command. He thought he'd cinched the collar tight with that threat to cut my rent money. Across the table, Dylan was already cutting into his steak. His shoulders relaxed. The sound of his knife against the gold-rimmed porcelain was a dry, high-pitched rattle of tin. He thought the heavy lifting was done. He thought our father had just bought him a lifetime of silence. I stood up slowly. My chair didn't scrape this time. I lifted it with a single, controlled motion. I didn't need the drama of a screeching chair. My presence was enough of a noise. "Keep your money, Richard," I said. My voice was low, vibrating with a cold frequency that stopped Diane's fork mid-air. "In fact, save it. You're going to need it for the legal fees." The room went still. Richard's smirk didn't disappear. It just froze, turning into a brittle mask of confusion. He stared at me like I'd just spoken a dead language. "I received my deployment orders yesterday," I continued. I looked him dead in the eye, ignoring the way his face started to redden. "Pentagon, Washington, D.C., I leave in 48 hours. My apartment is already empty. There's a U-Haul truck sitting 2 blocks away with 11 boxes containing every shred of my life. I don't need your safety net. I never did. You can stop signing the checks, Richard. I'm off the payroll." Richard's mouth opened, then shut. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was made of thin, rotting ice. Dylan's fork clattered against his plate, a tinny, desperate sound. "Al, let's go in the den," Dylan stammered. His face was turning a sickly shade of gray, the color of old dishwater. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. Let's talk privately. There's no need for this in front of Brooke." "No," I said. The word was a bullet. There are no more private talks, no more family secrets. The time for playing along is over. I reached into my bag and pulled out my ruggedized military laptop. It was a block of matte black magnesium, scarred and dented from real work. I slammed it down in the center of the mahogany table, right next to the platter of cooling ribeyes. The grease on the meat was already congealing. Crack! The sound was sharp, final, like a hammer hitting a nail into a coffin. I flipped the lid open. The blue light flooded the room, washing out the warm, fake glow of the chandelier. I didn't wait for them to look. I navigated to the split-screen view I had prepared. Look at the screen, Richard. Look at it, Diane. On the left, lines of source code in blue. My work, date-stamped 2 years ago at the Academy. On the right, the Meridian Corporate Repository in red. Dylan's work, date-stamped 8 months later. The logic gates were identical. The variable names were changed, but the math was a mirror image. It was a digital fingerprint left on a stolen diamond. Your golden son didn't disrupt anything, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, cloying scent of pot roast. He's a common thief. He spent the last 3 years strip mining my cloud storage while I was in the dirt. He built his VP title on my sweat. He bought that ring for Brooke with a bonus he stole from my work. Dylan let out a pathetic, high-pitched laugh. It sounded like a rat caught in a trap. Richard, she's lying. She's making this up. She's tech-savvy. She could have forged those timestamps. She's just jealous of the promotion. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just spun the laptop around until the screen was 3 inches from his twitching face. Then explain it, Dylan, I commanded. My voice was a steel blade. Explain the damping mechanism. Tell everyone at this table why the feedback loop suppresses at the 10th layer. Tell them why the weights shift to a nonlinear vector at the threshold. Explain your own code. Right now. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dylan's throat moved as he tried to swallow, but he was bone dry. His eyes darted to Richard, looking for a lifeline, then to Diane. They both stared at him, waiting. The silence stretched until I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Dylan opened his mouth, but nothing came out but a wet, rattling breath. He didn't know. He couldn't even fake the vocabulary. He was a hollow suit sitting in a room full of people who had just seen the ghost inside. He called me 3 weeks ago, I said, looking at Brooke. She was staring at Dylan with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He called me in a panic because he couldn't explain this exact block to the Meridian board. I have the 22-minute recording of him begging for help on this drive. I taught him how to use the weapon he stole just so I could catch him holding it. Brooke stood up. She didn't say a word to Richard or Diane. She didn't even look at the diamond on her finger. She grabbed her leather clutch, shoved her chair back with a violence that made it tip over with a heavy thud, and walked out. The front door slammed so hard the portraits in the hallway rattled. Dylan slumped in his chair, his head hanging low. He looked like a balloon that had finally popped. Richard sat there, his face ashen, a single vein pulsing in his temple. For the first time in 28 years, the great Richard Wilcox was speechless. He looked at the screen, then at the son he had championed, and saw the void. Diane reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the edge of the laptop. Her family first mantra had finally hit the wall of reality. She looked at Dylan, then at me, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of an emotional connection. I was done being the bridge for their lies. I stood there for a beat, letting the wreckage and the silence sink in. I didn't feel happy, I just felt clean. The air in the room was finally clear of the oily smell of deception. I snapped the laptop shut and tucked it away. The click was the final word. I didn't look at Dylan. I didn't look at the parents who tried to buy my dignity for the price of a month's rent. I zipped my stiff field jacket to the chin, the sound of the teeth locking together loud in the silent room. Enjoy the dinner, I said. I'm going to D.C. I walked out the door and didn't look back. I could hear the heavy, frantic sound of Dylan trying to explain himself to Richard, but the wind was already picking up outside. The U-Haul was waiting down the street. My life was packed. Behind me, the house was a crime scene of their own making. Ahead of me, the road was dark, open, and finally, completely mine. The highway was a black ribbon of wet asphalt cutting through the pre-dawn fog. I-90 West. 05:30 hours. The U-Haul hummed beneath me, a low mechanical vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots and settled in my marrow. The air inside the cabin was thin, smelling of stale coffee and the cold metallic scent of the heavy-duty heater. I kept my left hand on the steering wheel, my grip loose but disciplined. My right thumb hovered over the glowing screen of my phone, mounted to the dash. One file. 46 pages of digital wreckage. Meridian_security_breach_Wilcox.pd1elf. I didn't hesitate, I didn't pray. I just tapped the send button. The progress bar flickered, a tiny blue line of execution, and then, sent. I watched the road. The orange glow of the highway lights strobed across my face, regular as a heartbeat. 2 emails were now sitting in the inboxes of the Meridian Compliance Board and the University Academic Integrity Committee. I had just pulled the pin on a grenade and driven away into the sunrise. I wasn't looking for a thank you. I was looking for a total wipeout. July hit Chicago like a sledgehammer. The humidity was thick enough to choke on, but for Dylan Wilcox, the world went ice cold. It started on a Tuesday, mid-morning. Dylan was in his corner office at Meridian, probably staring out the glass walls at the skyline, imagining himself as the king of the world. He didn't see the 2 men in dark suits until they were standing in his doorway. They weren't there to talk about the quarterly earnings. They were from corporate security. The internal investigation had been short and surgical. My evidence didn't leave room for debate. The security logs from the family cloud matched the code commits in the Meridian repository down to the millisecond. Dylan didn't get to explain. He didn't get to call Richard. He was given 10 minutes to put his personal items into a cardboard box, a cheap, flimsy thing that looked pathetic in his manicured hands. He was escorted out of the building by 2 guards who didn't even look him in the eye. His badge was snapped in half. His corporate credit card was flagged. The golden boy was walked past the cubicles of the people he had looked down on, a thief in an expensive suit, followed by the silent judgment of the entire floor. Then came the letter, a formal notice of a clawback lawsuit. Meridian wanted their money back. All of it. The $180,000 performance bonus he had used to buy Brooke's ring and the German sedan. The lawyers were coming for his bank accounts with the same hunger he had shown for my work. August was worse. The university didn't care about family support or supporting each other. They cared about their reputation. The registrar's office sent a certified letter to the house in Naperville. I wasn't there to see Richard's face when he opened it, but I could imagine the color of his skin. Gray, like ash. The Master of Science degree Dylan had bragged about for 6 years was revoked, nullified, voided. On paper, the high-flying vice president was now nothing more than a high school graduate with a history of academic fraud. Every tech firm in the country had his name on a blacklist before the week was out. He was a ghost in the industry, a fraud who had run out of people to rob. But the real casualty report was waiting in Richard's living room. Dylan had been living a lie he couldn't afford. To buy that house in the suburbs and the car, he'd needed a cosigner. He'd needed a safety net. Richard, ever the proud father, had put his name on a $350,000 mortgage and a car loan, convinced that his son was a genius who would never fail. He had signed his name with a gold pen, thinking he was building a legacy. He was actually signing a death warrant for his own retirement. With Dylan unemployed and facing a $100,000 lawsuit, the bank didn't wait. The letters started arriving in thick, white envelopes. Foreclosure warnings, default notices. Because Dylan was a high-risk actor, the bank didn't play nice. They looked at the cosigner. They looked at Richard Wilcox. Richard's 401k, the money he had spent 30 years accumulating through corporate grinds and calculated risks, was suddenly in the crosshairs. The bank didn't care about his pride. They didn't care about Sunday dinners or the gold-rimmed china. They wanted the $350,000 he had guaranteed for a son who was now a pariah. The financial sentence I had received at the dinner table had flipped. It had traveled back up the line, following the money until it found the source, By the end of the month, the house Dylan lived in was gone. The car was repossessed, towed away in the middle of the night with the alarm screaming. Richard was forced to sell his own assets just to keep the bank from seizing the family home. The monument to the Wilcox name was being torn down brick by brick, crushed under the weight of the lies they had nurtured. I was sitting in my new office at the Pentagon when the news finally reached its peak. The air was cool, smelling of fresh paint and industrial ozone. My desk was clean. No clutter, no lies. I was dressed in a crisp uniform, my rank insignia bright under the fluorescent lights. My name was at the top of the latest National Cybersecurity Journal. The real author. The only author. My phone buzzed on the metal desk. The vibration was a short, aggressive rattle. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in months. Dad. I stared at the phone. It kept vibrating, sliding an inch across the gray surface of the desk. Richard Wilcox was calling. He wasn't calling to congratulate me. He was calling because the bank had finally touched his money and he had no one else to blame but the daughter he had tried to bury. I let it ring. I watched the screen until it went dark. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and earned. I didn't need to answer. The report was finished. The casualties were counted. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't on the list. I picked up my pen and went back to work. There were new systems to build, systems that didn't have a backdoor for family. Washington, D.C. didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like a bunker. I sat on the floor of my new studio apartment, leaning against the cold, eggshell white drywall that still smelled of fresh primer and industrial floor wax. Outside, the rain was a relentless gray sheet, turning the Potomac into a river of lead. My 11 cardboard boxes were stacked against the far wall, sealed tight with that same shrieking tape, looking like a row of silent, unexploded bombs. I didn't have a bed yet. I didn't have a television. I just had a single folding chair I'd salvaged from a thrift store and a burner phone sitting on the hardwood floor between my boots. I was officially a ghost in the Wilcox family tree, but the roots were still trying to trip me in the dark. The first vibration came at 02:15 hours. The phone rattled against the wood like a dying cicada. I didn't pick up. I just watched the screen glow, casting a sickly blue light against my knees. Dylan. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, it started again. I picked up on the third ring. I didn't say hello. I just listened to the static and the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end. You really did it, Elisa. Dylan's voice was a jagged, high-pitched wreck. The smug vice president was gone, replaced by a man who sounded like he'd been drinking his breakfast. You burned the whole house down. Meridian is suing me for the full clawback, every cent of the bonus, plus legal fees. The bank took the BMW this morning. Brooke is gone. I'm standing in a house I can't pay for, looking at a career that's a black hole. Are you happy? Does your little army ego feel big enough now? I took a slow sip of lukewarm water from a plastic bottle. The plastic crinkled in the silence. I didn't burn anything, Dylan. I just pointed out that you were standing in a bonfire you built yourself. I told you 3 months ago. Stop stealing my breath. You didn't listen. Help me. He suddenly shifted, his voice breaking into a pathetic, wet sob that made my skin crawl. Call them, Al. Tell the board it was a collaborative project. Tell them you gave me the keys to the drive. I'm your brother. We're blood. You can't just watch me rot on the street. I'll pay you back. I'll give you half of whatever I have left. Please. You couldn't explain the damping mechanism, Dylan. You sat at that table, and you couldn't even name the variables you stole. You aren't sorry you robbed me. You're just sorry you're too lazy to cover your tracks. Don't call this number again. I hung up. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I stared at the boxes. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. The second wave hit an hour later. A FaceTime request from Diane. I hit the green button just to see the face of the woman who had spent 28 years telling me to be smaller so my brother could look bigger. Diane looked 20 years older. Her hair was a mess and her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. She wasn't in her designer kitchen in Naperville. She was sitting in the back of Richard's car, the dark leather seats looking like a cage. "Elisa, please," she started, her voice thick with the kind of manipulative grief she'd used to keep me in line since I was a toddler. "Your father, he's a broken man. The bank froze the retirement accounts this morning. They're saying Richard is liable for the car loan and the mortgage Dylan defaulted on. They might take our house, Elisa, everything we worked 30 years for. How can you be so cold? How can you destroy your own parents over a few lines of computer code?" I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes. "Mom, Richard signed those papers because he wanted to believe his son was a god. He gambled your retirement on a lie because it made him look good at the country club. I'm a lieutenant in the United States Army. I swore an oath to protect the truth, not to subsidize Richard Wilcox's ego. If he's losing the house, it's because he co-signed for a thief." "He's your father!" she shrieked, the mask of the doting mother finally snapping. "He gave you everything." "He gave me a bill for my own silence, Mom, and I'm done paying it. Tell Richard to sell his vintage watch collection. Maybe that'll cover the interest for a month." I cut the feed before she could scream again. The final call came just as the sun started to bleed through the DC fog. No video, just a voice. It was Richard. He didn't sound like the judge of the dinner table anymore. He sounded like a man who had been hollowed out by a debt he couldn't bully his way out of. "Elisa," he said. The word was a dry, rattling ghost of a sound. "Richard, I wanted to say I'm sorry." I waited. I wanted to hear him say he was sorry for the years of being second best. I wanted him to say he was sorry for letting Dylan steal my work. "I'm sorry the bank is being so aggressive," he continued, his voice trembling with a terrifying weakness. "I didn't think the university would pull the degree. It's too much for one family to take. If you could just send a letter, tell them it was a misunderstanding. We can fix the finances. We can still be a family." I felt a cold, sharp laugh hit the back of my throat. "You aren't sorry for what you did to me, Richard. You're just sorry the invoice finally arrived. You taught Dylan how to be a predator, and you taught me to be the prey. You're only apologizing because the bank is at the door. Enjoy the silence. You earned it." I hung up for the last time. A single notification popped up on the screen. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "I moved my things out this morning. I didn't leave because of the code, Elisa. I left because I saw his face when you asked him to explain it. I saw the coward I was about to marry. You deserve better than that house. Good luck in DC. Brooke." I read it once. I didn't reply. I didn't save the number. I just highlighted the entire Wilcox contact list. Dylan, Diane, Richard, and hit the block button. One click. The hornet stopped buzzing. I stood up, walked to the stack of boxes, and pulled out my OCP field jacket. I folded it neatly, the stiff fabric resisting my hands. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow I had a job to do at the Pentagon. I walked to the window and watched the rain stop. The Wilcox family was a ghost story now, and I was done being afraid of ghosts. The morning mist on the Potomac River was a cold, honest shroud. It clung to the surface of the water, thick and gray, before the first rays of the District of Columbia sun started to burn it away. I sat on a weather-beaten wooden bench, the kind that had seen 1,000 soldiers and a million secrets. The wood was damp under my palms, smelling of river silt and old rain. I took a slow, deep pull of my coffee. It was black, hot, and cheap, bought from a street cart 3 blocks back. The steam hit my face, a sharp contrast to the biting air of an October dawn. For the first time in my 30 years on this earth, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It didn't feel like the quiet before a family explosion. It just felt like peace. 1 year. That was how long it had been since I'd driven that U-Haul across the state line and left the wreckage of the Wilcox name in my rearview mirror. A year of silence, a year of work. I looked down at the heavy, glossy magazine resting on my lap, the National Cybersecurity Journal. The paper was thick, high quality, and cold. I flipped to the lead article. There it was, printed in a crisp, black font that looked permanent. Optimization Protocols in Neural Adaptive Networks. And right below the title, the only name that mattered, Captain Elisa Wilcox, United States Army. There was no mention of Meridian, No shadow of Dylan, no smart gain marketing bullshit. Just the math, just the logic, just the truth. My promotion to captain had come through 6 months ago, not because of a co-signer or a family connection, but because the brass at the Pentagon knew a tactical asset when they saw one. I ran a finger over the letters of my name. It didn't feel like a souvenir anymore. It felt like a badge of rank I'd earned in a war fought with code and silence. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A short, professional pulse. I pulled it out. It wasn't a call from a ghost. It was a notification from my banking app. A deposit from a joint account I'd forgotten to close years ago. $500. A week later, a thick, cream-colored envelope had arrived at my secure military post office box. No return address, but I knew the stationery. Inside was a personal check from Diane Wilcox, written in her shaky, decorative cursive. There was a small yellow post-it note stuck to the back. "We miss you, Elisa. Love, Mom." I looked at the check for a long minute. $500. It was a drop of water in the ocean of debt Richard and Dylan were drowning in. It was a bribe, a guilt offering, a desperate hook thrown into the dark, hoping to snag the daughter they'd spent decades trying to drown. I didn't get angry. I didn't feel that familiar hot spike of resentment in my gut. I just reached into my bag, pulled out a plain white envelope, and slipped the check back inside. I didn't write a long letter. I didn't explain my feelings. I just scrawled a single sentence on the back of the note in a steady, military hand. "Keep this. You have a mortgage to pay." I sealed it and dropped it in the blue mailbox on the corner. It wasn't a jab. It wasn't a joke. It was a hard, steel boundary. I was done subsidizing their lies, and I was done accepting their hollow apologies. The cord wasn't just cut. The ends were cauterized. I turned back to the river. The sun was higher now, a pale gold disk breaking through the bridge supports. I thought about Dylan. I'd heard through the grapevine that he was working a low-level IT job at a suburban strip mall, living in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled of desperation and old takeout. Richard had sold the sedan. They were hanging onto the Naperville house by their fingernails, fighting a legal battle with Meridian that they were destined to lose. I realized then that I didn't hate them. Hate is a heavy pack, and I'd carried enough weight for one lifetime. To hate someone, you have to let them live in your head. You have to keep them fed. I had just stopped feeding them. I had pulled the foundation out from under the house they'd built on my back, and I'd let gravity do the rest. They weren't villains in my story anymore. They were just people who had made a bad bet on the wrong child. A group of soldiers from the nearby base jogged past my bench. The sound of their running shoes on the asphalt was a rhythmic, collective heartbeat. Crunch, crunch, crunch. One of them, a master sergeant with a face like a topographical map, caught my eye. He gave a sharp, professional nod. "Morning, Captain," he grunted. "Morning, Sergeant," I replied. My voice was steady, solid. I watched them disappear into the mist, their shadows blending into the trees. They were my family now. The kind of family that didn't care about your pedigree, only your performance. The kind that watched your six because it was the right thing to do, not because they wanted a piece of your bonus. I looked at the Potomac one last time. The water was a slate gray mirror, cold and honest. The mist was gone. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and tucked the journal under my arm. I felt the weight of the magnesium laptop in my backpack, the same one that had delivered the final blow at the dinner table. It felt light now. I started walking. My boots hit the pavement with a certain, independent tempo. I didn't look back at the bridge. I didn't look back at Chicago. I looked at the Pentagon rising up in the distance, a fortress of iron and stone. The campaign was over. The mission was a success. I wasn't the girl who stayed at the train station anymore. I was the woman who had walked away and built her own city. I took a breath of the sharp autumn air and kept moving. I had finally found the way home, and for the first time, I was the only one with the keys.